So welcome everyone to our SICTIC webinar, Investing in Trust, Assessing Cybersecurity and Digital Resilience in Startups. This is kind of like a lead up to our upcoming SICTIC Investor Day at Unlimitrust campus on the 28th of April, which usually focuses on the topics of data security, cybersecurity, AI, trust, these kinds of topics. We have a great speaker lineup today. We'll have a short, quickly show you. Oh, this is me for those of you who don't know me. I'm Joelle. I'm the event manager at SICTIC. I usually organize the SICTIC Investor Days, and today I'll be your host in this webinar. So the agenda is short and sweet. You'll have a few words from me around SICTIC. Then we'll hear from Bianca Bonetti around sisterpreneurs, building a community supporting women. And then we'll have Francesca Bosco, who will talk to you a bit about trust and cybersecurity. Obviously, we have a Q&A. And then that's already it. Briefly about SICTIC, for those of you who don't know, we're the leading angel investor club here in Switzerland. We have about 500 members at this point from all over Switzerland. And basically our core mission is to bring angel investors, smart money investors together with early stage startups, which is also what we do at our SICTIC Investor Days. And there we combine private, professional, and institutional investors. For you to give you a quick overview of where our SICTIC community lives in Switzerland, you can see we have a bit of a cluster, but as you can see, we're literally all over Switzerland, which is really very cool for us as well, and for the startups, of course. We can do what we do thanks to our amazing partners, which some of them are also talking today in this webinar. Of course, we have a great selection of event hosts. You see that with all our events across Switzerland. And then, of course, our institutional and annual investors who help us and support us in our mission. In case you don't follow us yet on social media, do that. I can absolutely recommend it. You'll see startup lineups, things like this webinar, speaker announcements whenever you find us at other partner events or generally also international events. We'll announce that on social media, as well as our educational content, which are our SICTIC Academy sessions. Those are also held in the German-speaking part of Switzerland. So we have some in Zurich and in Bern, and then, of course, also in Lausanne and Geneva. And we're also now just building a community in the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland. So I can definitely recommend it. Also, if you ever want to go to an event and you're still looking for discounted tickets or something, check out our social media. We usually get a discount code there as well. So that's already it from my side. I would hand it over to Bianca, founder of Sisterpreneurs. And I will just unshare my screen.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Joelle, for introducing. And I am very excited to be here with you today. I'm going to share my screen.
Oh, also one super brief side note. Of course, if you have any questions or anything, feel free to put them also in the chat, and we'll make sure that we get to it.
Can you see it correctly?
We can see the full slide, yes.
Okay, great. Well, again, thank you very much for having us today. I'm super pleased, and thanks, Joelle, for the intro. I will take a brief moment to think about the problem of female entrepreneurship, but also why it's so important to talk about it. So, in general, the gender gap in venture capital is not just a fairness issue, but it is one of the most urgent economic challenges of our time. Let's start from the problem. I want to share with you a number. I'm a mathematician originally, so I like numbers. 1%. So when we think about businesses, 1/3 of businesses in Europe are actually founded by women. 1/3, so around like 30, a little bit more than 30%. Yet in 2024, so not long time ago, but it's the year we have the most data. Women-founded startups received only 1% of the total venture capital funding. So as we can see, there is a problem of funding. Where does the capital go? So all female founding team receive 1%, mixed teams receive 12%, and all male founding teams receive around 87%. So as you can see, as we said, it is an unfair game for women, but we're going to also touch why is this happening and what's the potential if we invest more in women. This is a loop that currently justifies itself. So we need to kind of like break the cycle. What does it mean? If you speak to an investor, it says, but there is not enough women to invest in. And if you speak to an entrepreneur, they're gonna tell you, there's not funding enough. So this is kind of like a call to action for everyone participating in the webinar, saying both sides are actually right. But we need to break this loop deliberately because otherwise it will continue. The real issue for women, female entrepreneurship is actually access. We're 50% of the population, we're present, we're building, operating, contributing to the economy. But the gap is not about participation, it is about access. So we're talking about 4, let's call them rings. Human capital, financial capital, social capital, and lack of role models. So it's really important to actually identify what are the real issues for this to happen in order to be able to actually solve those problems. So like our role, my co-founder role is actually activate on all the issues in order to be able to empower women entrepreneurs. Now, who is actually today controlling the capital? 85% of GPs in Europe are men, while only 15% are women. So even if the wealth is coming from the women, the people who are actually managing their wealth are men. And I recently even read on an article that 92% of the funnel of the investment is actually run by men. So I'm not saying that men are, I'm not dividing the topic. I'm just saying there are unconscious bias. So when the capital is actually allocated by people who have similar backgrounds, similar networks and perspective, it generally goes more to men. So we kind of like need to operate on different levels. And one is this. When investors actually invest, there is a study from Harvard Review Business School that shows that male founders are asked about the positive side, growth and ambition, what can happen with your amazing business, while female founders are generally asked about risk and failure, losses, contingencies, sustainability concerns, so like the problems. So whenever an investor actually makes an investment, it invests in the narrative, in the stories that we're telling. So basically what happens is that most of the times, even the questions, they need to be really careful to be not gender biased. This is a call for the investors. This is something I really care about. So I'm a STEM, I have a STEM background. I'm a mathematician. And in general, I don't think we pay enough attention of the very early funnel of the education. So what happened is that in general, women have less access to scientific education for many reasons, cultural background, accessibility. But what happens is that they study less STEM, so they generally have less STEM background and they go less into this type of careers. And so that's the reason why we have less technical entrepreneurs. the risk paradox. According to OECD research, women are not, because I oftentimes hear, but women have more fear of the risk. Actually, this is not true. We're not more risk averse, but we are penalized when we take risks. So we basically risk more. So the system penalizes us. So we are generally oftentimes culturally driven to taking less risks. Now, this is the very important part of the conversation because we have highlighted what's happening. This is a very brief introduction. Happy to go deeper in another session, but this is a very important economic opportunity. So, according to a study made by BCG, we are missing an opportunity of from 3 to 6 trillion globally, because investing in women entrepreneurship would mean increasing economical exchange, trade. So like we are actually missing out on the economical opportunity. That's the reason, that is one of the reasons, but the importance of the project we launched is called Sistrepreneurs. We want to connect women, empower them, and supporting the growth of their businesses. As I have slowly highlighted before, there are many, the four rings we saw, there are many things we can tackle. But in general, like as I said, the real problem is the access. So we want to build a shared access for women to come together and have equal opportunities, the same as men. So the fact that there is a lack of networks says, okay, we need to build this. So we are working on different scales. We're working on knowledge. We're working on lack of role models. We are working on media in order to create examples for the new generations to be entrepreneurs. So we basically want the women to be surrounded by a good positive circle so that they can become entrepreneurs, grow their businesses, and this will have a positive economical outcome to everyone. So this is what we are aiming to do. I think in general, what we need to lean in is also our responsibility toward the society. So that's the reason why we created Sistrepreneurs. Thank you very much. I think for now, it's that's our brief intro. Happy to reply to any of the questions you might have, and happy to continue listening to the webinar. Thank you, Joelle.
Thank you, Bianca. Great. We'll also have some time for Q&A at the end, as mentioned before. So if any questions come up later, feel free to also put them in the chat. Or then, of course, looking at the participants list, basically all of you have my email address. So if any questions come up later, feel free to reach out to me as well. I would then hand over to Francesca and to the main part of our webinar today.
Thank you so much. And let me share my screen. So can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Let me put it in slideshow. Okay, excellent. So thank you so much, and thanks a lot for the invite and for the introduction. And actually, it was very inspiring to hear from Bianca, and I will immediately try to follow the group as well because it was extremely interesting. So without further ado, because I know that we don't have so much time, but I will also leave my my contact at the end, and let's try to secure some time at the end of the presentation for some Q&A. But indeed, as Joel was mentioning, if you have any questions, just drop them in the chat, and we'll try to address them. Just as a very brief intro, you've seen my bio, but I always say I'm a recovering lawyer, meaning that I studied international law with, specifically focusing on on human rights. But then I quickly, let's say, by joining the UN, I quickly turned into working on the more the research and technical assistance and capacity building on cybercrime, cybersecurity, misuse of technology. I spent there many, many years. And then I joined the World Economic Forum, where I strengthened my, let's say, the collaboration with the private sector, with the corporate sector. And then 5 years ago, well, almost 6 years ago, I jump on the other side of the fence to join the civil society community, and I joined the CyberPeace Institute, which is a global nonprofit that is focusing on basically providing cybersecurity for free to other civil society organizations and to the nonprofit community, and basically increasing digital resilience as global public good, also by understanding the impact of cyber threats. And thanks to this various engagement, I also had the opportunity to work a lot with the startup environment. Notably, I'm also part of the Trust Valley Advisory Board when it comes to the Tech for Trust program. I would like to just give some, let's say, food for thoughts. The topic is very wide, so I'll try to select, pick and choose some of the issues that I think might be more interesting for the group. And the idea would be to go from the current, basically, threat and risk landscape to situate, basically, what we're talking about, and also what we have to consider as investor, and a couple of thoughts on also evaluating cybersecurity and what I call a security adjacent, let's say, startup. So on one hand, why in general we need to care about cybersecurity, but also specifically for cybersecurity startup, but also the role of investor post-investment. Let's see if we have let's say, the time to go through all of them. So first of all, why we cannot ignore, let's say, and also why the reason basically behind this webinar. So I would say that and you might have perceived this as well. So cyber risk is no longer just a technical issue. Today, it really directly affects startup evaluation, scaling, but also exit potential. And the startups operate in an environment that is shaped by the global geopolitical and technological forces. So this is why we need also to understand the risk, not only as a purely, I would say, technical and cyber-related risk, but situate this in the, let's say, in the reality that we're living, but also thinking about the potential future development. And indeed, investors who understand the resilience, I would say that have a decisive hedge. I always like to, I usually quote my old, let's say, job place, the World Economic Forum Global Risk Report. I highly recommend two readings. One is the Global Risk Report that is usually presented in Davos, but also the Global Cybersecurity Outlook, because it's very informative. And I use them both for the presentation and a couple of other resources. Happy to give you the references. Why I like to use these references specifically, because basically what the Global Risk Report is showing is that again, cyber risk isn't isolated, interacts with the war, which is something that unfortunately is it's unfortunately one of the main topic of our days. It relates with AI governance, for example, and notably with the AI governance gaps and challenges, and also with economic instability. For investors, this means also that startup portfolios are exposed basically to systemic shocks, again, not just, I would say, isolated incidents. And we will see this in a while. Just a couple of numbers and data, I always have, I'm always hesitant, in mentioning data because what I prefer to talk about, and we will have a couple of examples later, it's also about real case examples. And do not forget, and this is a big part also of my job, is that do not forget that behind these data, there are people. And I mean, there are economies, there are institutions, there are organizations, but ultimately there are people. I just would like to mention, I mean, the dimension basically of the phenomenon that we are talking about, and with the caveat that still, I mean, here, I mean, I decided to quote the WEF report. You will find several other reports with the caveat that, and also by my experience working a lot, both with the private sector, but also with the institutions, and notably with the law enforcement and with ministries, cybercrime, I mean, I would say we improved a lot, but still one of the biggest issues that we have with cyber threats, besides the kind of like unpredictability, it's also the real dimension, because there is still quite a challenge when it comes to reporting. And also we have to think about them at the same time as a sort of like international and global phenomenon, but also with a local dimension. So this is also an important impact. Another element that I think it's worth stressing is obviously the role that AI is currently playing in the cyber threat ecosystem. And we've seen, I mean, again, several reports, but I mean, there's a general understanding that AI-powered attacks are rising fastest, and this is also the perception, let's say, from corporate leaders. For example, cyber-enabled fraud now surpasses ransomware, that historically has been one of the, let's say, biggest perceived threats, I would say, and real threats when it comes to cyber. There is also another very important dimension, which I think is extremely relevant when we think about the startup ecosystem, and not considering it is in silo, I would say, is the supply chain and the third-party dependencies, meaning that the supply chain concept allow us also to understand how when we think about vulnerabilities and risk, we have to think about them more in terms of like major systemic vulnerabilities, because they might impact throughout the overall supply chain. In general, I mean, with these notes, I would like to highlight that globally, cyber risk is growing in scale, speed, and impact. It doesn't mean that cyber defenses are not advancing as well, and notably also thanks to AI. But I mean, it's a sort of like always like an even race, meaning that AI is indeed accelerating attacks, fraud is overtaking ransomware, and as mentioned, the supply chain vulnerabilities are creating systemic threats. Startups are embedded basically in these networks. So, I mean, also as investors, it's important to understand how these threats basically can cascade basically through the portfolio. We talk about the global landscape, but maybe let's have a quick focus on Europe specifically, and Switzerland. And then we can move in what I always call the so what, meaning, okay, we know about the risk, but then what we can do about it. A brief mentioning about Europe. Again, I'm with my, let's say, background of researcher, I'm always hesitant again in mentioning specific report, because they all have their challenges. I think that the ENISA, the EU cybersecurity agency, is doing a fairly good job, and specifically they publish every year the cyber threat landscape report, which is I think it's an extremely interesting reading. And again, just to give some numbers. and basically last year between 2024 and 2025, they analyzed more than 4,000, almost 5,000 incidents. What I think it's interesting, and again, why it's important to have this discussion and to situate the risk in the current geopolitical environment, is that 80% were, let's say, kind of like tied to geopolitical motivation. Even small companies, including startups, are targeted because they are potential entry points, for example, into larger networks, and also the supply chain, let's say, vulnerability concept. For investors, this translates into potential operational, reputational, but also exit risk. Let's have a focus in a little bit more on the Swiss ecosystem. Swiss ecosystem is doing very well, as you might know, and there are also very recent reports that are praising, I would say, the overall Swiss system. Swiss startups, and again, I mean, data might vary, but I think the interesting data is that they saw 3.3 billion Swiss franc in venture capital in 2025, and which is estimated as a sort of like a 44% of increase over 2024. I would definitely say, and also due to my experience in working with many other European countries, and also very much abroad, notably with I'm very familiar with the US ecosystem as well. I would say that this sector is really, I mean, leading this growth. So software, analytics, tech services are deeply connected to digital trust and cybersecurity. Again, how I would say, however, or again, these startups are often embedded in global platforms and supply chains, meaning that a single incident can kind of like ripple across the network. And so it's super important that also to consider another relevant aspect when we think about the startup environment. Early stage companies also face, I mean, I have to say, on one hand, at least for my experience, there is still a sort of like awareness gap, awareness and knowledge gap. Well, I would say more awareness gap. On the other hand, also, they often face resource constraints, which makes operational and reputational risk a real factor for the ecosystem in which they are operating. So not only for the startups, but also for potentially for investors. So I would really say that, and I definitely stress this, meaning that cyber and digital resilience, I do believe that they are no longer, let's say, optional or an afterthought. It's a direct input, basically, on how you evaluated the growth and the potential risk exposure in the, I mean, in the Swiss ecosystem, but I would say in the startup ecosystem. Let's be practical and I mean, just a very brief outline. I mean, again, we would need a whole other webinar basically to go deep into this, but I just wanted to give some reference point when it comes to which are the top cyber threats that are affecting the startups and investment outcomes. Again, the list can be definitely longer, but just to give you an idea, I try to separate the threat, but also try to understand, okay, why investors should think about them, and what might be the investor impact. I have to stress one thing before going through them. Most of these incidents are not highly sophisticated and also are predictable, meaning they are preventable weaknesses. And I really would like to stress this also because I do believe that the investor community can also have a sort of like role to play when it comes to promoting also cybersecurity awareness and let's say basic cyber hygiene when it comes to the startup ecosystem. These, I mean, there are not, I mean, they are not, I often say they are not exotic, let's say, and they often stem from governance gaps or like scaling issues, misconfiguration. And so understanding these threats really allow us to understand how to improve how they might impact the operational quality and long-term portfolio risk, but also how to easily, in a way, improve the overall ecosystem. So I'm saying they're not exotic because most of them, you might recognize them historically. I mean, phishing and social engineering are still one of the most common way attackers gain access to system. And usually they target founders, finance teams, and executives. And obviously, I mean, the risk might go from fraud to reputational damage. I mentioned before ransomware. Still, ransomware is impacting business continuity risk, is increasingly affecting smaller companies and so not just large enterprises. And obviously here the impact is much more focusing on the operations and, for example, data loss and also emergency funding needs. I mentioned before the misconfiguration. So, for example, cloud misconfiguration is very common in fast-growing startups that are using cloud infrastructure. And here, the type of risk is like, for example, unintended data exposure and also compliance issues. We also have, let's say, the some risks that are more related to the governance. And so, for example, when it comes to weak identity and access. So, for example, shared credentials, lack of access control, no MFA, multi-factor authentication. I know they sound, let's say, redundant measures, but they are super important and they really can amplify basically potential weaknesses and threat exposure. Because from a single point of failure that can risk a full system compromise. And then just to finish, I mentioned before that the supply chain and the third party risk. Startups rely heavily on external tools or, for example, APIs on collaboration with partners, and often I would say the cybersecurity measures adopted by the different entities are uneven. And so they might also run the risk of having indirect breaches through trusted providers. Just very quickly, a couple of real cases. I decided to bring a couple of cases of startups. And one is the case of OneTrust. It's a trust and compliance platform. They are a venture-backed startup providing privacy, data governance, compliance software. And I mean, I would say that they serve large enterprise globally. So they have a sort of like a highly trust-sensitive positioning. What happened is that in a couple of years ago, in 2023, a third-party vendor vulnerability led to a security incident, which exposed basically the customer data within the platform. I would say the immediate consequence was that trust was impacted in a sort of like a trust product company, obviously. They increase in a way that the customer scrutiny, but also it means also higher cost for remediation, for example, for audits and vendor risk management. And ultimately, from an investor standpoint, this affects obviously the revenue predictability, the growth trajectory. It raises due diligence requirements. So this has, again, a very practical impact. Similarly, another very famous, I would say, well, they started as a fintech and they are, I mean, a larger consumer platform. They are a European scale up offering buy now, pay later type of solution and digital payment solution. I guess, I mean, some of you might be familiar with it. Is one of Europe's most prominent, I would say, fintech startup. And again, it operates in a high trust and consumer-facing financial environment. So in 2021, they had a technical security failure that exposed the user account, allowing customers basically to briefly access other users' data. It was not, I would say, a classic external hack, but more a critical internal security control failure. And what it means immediate loss of customer trust and public backlash, obviously. Regulatory scrutiny from data protection authorities, because obviously it opens the file at the data protection authorities. Again, increase cost to sustain, and also highlighted the weaknesses in internal controls during a very rapid scaling. And so why invest, I mean, and the impact on the side also that indeed cyber risk should also include internal failures and not just external attacks. This is very important for the next concept. And also demonstrate how scaling fast without robust controls really create a systemic risk. I wanted to bring a couple of like different examples, one of sort of like external hack and the other one more from internal to really understand why it's important to consider cyber and digital resilience as core investment considerations. So we mentioned before the rapid, let's say, scale of startups in general, but also notably tech or cyber-related startups. In Europe, venture capital continues to flow into strategic tech sectors such as AI, notably in this moment, hence also the focus on the geopolitical risk when it comes to defense, for example. Tech sovereignty, it's also a very strong trend. And these are really areas where trust and resilience are not optional, but they are pretty key, I would say, differentiators. And so I would say that the takeaway for investors in general is that the startups that demonstrate robust cyber and digital resilience tend to command higher valuations, scale faster, and also achieve a more predictable exit. And I would say that in the Swiss context, companies that align their operation with these principles are also more attractive, basically, for loan funding and strategic partnership. I would say that resilience, we moved from thinking about the cyber resilience as a sort of like a nice to have and a sort of like cybersecurity as a cost, more into resilience as an investment signal. And this is also how investors can distinguish between startups that can survive and thrive, I would say, in a systemic cyber risk environment versus the ones that are exposed. I was mentioning before the so what, and this is why it's also important to address both external risk, but also internal weaknesses and failures. Because, here, and again, super briefly, to go through how we can assess a sort of like resilient by design a startup. And I try to identify three main areas. One is definitely governance and leadership. Cyber risk need to be integrated into strategy. So cyber risk should be part basically of the startup strategic DNA. Leadership accountability matters. Is there, for example, a chief security officer or an equivalent reporting to the board? Evidence shows that companies with security-aware governance are significantly less likely to suffer major operational incident. Then obviously there is the dimension of architecture and product design. So looking at the product architecture, are, for example, security controls baked into the platform, or again, more in a way develop as an afterthought. It's super important that the by design element. So common early stage mistakes, I would say, like shared credentials, poor access control, misconfigured cloud services, as we mentioned before, are predictable but costly. And so startups that avoid these pitfalls really reduce operational and financial risk. And then there is the dimension of risk anticipation and adaptability, meaning we need to assess how the startup anticipates risk and adapts. So do they have, for example, a very basic, let's say, measure is the incident response plans, for example. So run simulations, and so it's also a good way to learn basically from actual and emerging threats. Startups with a strong resilience culture recover faster and also reduce the downstream investment risk, and also they can be more attractive, I would say, for funding and acquisition. Having a very quick look at the more cybersecurity and security adjacent startups. Here, a very brief, look into when it happens that you're considering investing in cybersecurity startups. I would say, let's say, traction alone doesn't guarantee investability, meaning that it's not enough to say that they are a cybersecurity startup. And again, this is also coming from my direct experience with the Tech for Trust program. So what do you want to see? Or my suggestion would be really to see funders with proven expertise in security or relevant tech domains, a scalable architecture. This is designed with the security in mind, again, avoiding common pitfalls. Clear market, I would say, validation and differentiation, meaning the startup solves a problem that others cannot. So it's kind of like filling a gap. And also the ecosystem and timing fit. For example, in the leveraging, I would say that the Swiss deep tech strengths, also for global opportunities. So I would say focus on startups that embed the resilience and trust again into the strategy and product, not just because it's trendy, basically. And these are the companies I really believe that are most likely to deliver more long-term growth and also reduce basically the portfolio risk. Allow me to finish with a couple of consideration. One is the role of investors. As mentioned, this webinar was more kind of like giving you some food for thoughts and maybe some depending on the different expertise, but giving you some entry points, some things that maybe you would like to dig further. I do believe that investors can play a role in supporting let's say, the overall digital resilience of the startup ecosystem, not just let's say in the assessment and investing phase, but also in the post-investment. Why I'm saying this? Because I do believe that the role of, I do see the role of investors as a sort of like strategic role. And this is why I also wanted to focus a little bit on the post-investment. Just investors are not just assessors of risk, but I do believe that you are active partners in building resilience. So, for example, promoting governance by ensuring board level reporting and clear KPIs. Or for example, helping, and this I see this a lot, and it's super valuable, connecting founders to, for example, technical mentors or industry experts. Again, embed the resilience into scaling plans. So from cloud hygiene to supply chain vetting, security should not be considered as a sort of like a break, but it should be considered as a strategic investment to help us scaling and growing the startup. Also encourage transparency. I mentioned before that one of the biggest challenges that I still see in the, I would say, cyber threat ecosystem is that there's a lot of underreporting. There is still the issue of like, besides the awareness, but there is still the issue of obviously the shame that is coming with being hacked, the potential reputational risk and damages and so on and so forth. I do believe that encouraging transparency through incident reporting and also learning cycles, it's vital also within the startup ecosystem. And I, I do believe that when investors play this strategic role, startups can convert security discipline into a sort of like what I would call a competitive advantage, basically, improving funding prospects, market credibility, and also exit potential. And then maybe the closing comment and reflection is that I do believe so. Well, building on the data that I was showing before, and I mean, and most of the reports that you might be very familiar with. So that the Switzerland startup ecosystem is growing, highly digital. But again, I really want to stress that cyber risks are systemic and not hypothetical. And also investing in startups that embed trust and digital resilience in a strategic way to protect and enhance evaluation, partnership, and exit multiples. Before investing, ask yourself, is this startup building an ecosystem of trust or it's simply delivering a product? And this is super important. Those factors those startups that focus on systemic resilience are the ones that will scale, I would say, successfully, but also deliver in a way sustainable returns. So it's definitely a sort of like a key competitive advantage. I will stop here. And if there's any question, I also leave my profile in case of any specific question. If you want specific references, a deep dive into some of the topic, super happy to.
Thank you so much, Francesca. That was super interesting. I will also, for our participants, I will share this recording with you and also Francesca's slides.
Yeah.
So you also, if you want to have another look, we'll definitely share them afterwards as well. There is one question, Francesca. I don't know if you can see it in the Q&A. I'm also quickly going to read it out loud. Also, if any other of you want to have ask any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A. First question from Edward was, these cases really highlight the gap between having policies and actually seeing what's happening in real time. Is there any discussion around actively monitoring the governance between operations and the AI tools companies use daily, not just auditing after something goes wrong?
So that's a very, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. I think it's a growing concern in the AI governance specifically. I mean, at least I've seen definitely a rise in the AI governance space. So the difference between reactive auditing, I would say, and proactive real-time oversight. It's true that most organizations today rely heavily, I would say, on the post hoc, I would say, audits, compliance checks, and periodic reviews, and this means that you can only catch problems after they have impacted users or processes. But there is an increased discussion around the continuous monitoring frameworks, specifically for AI operations. I would say that so first of all, the operational monitoring versus, allow me to say, the policy enforcement. So policies set the rules, but without active monitoring, companies can see basically when the AI tools start behaving outside basically those rules. So there are some interesting research, but also some interesting, I would say, solutions put out by the industry in basically exploring ways to integrate, I would say, instrumentation and also logging directly into the AI workflows. So it's a sort of like, I would say, governance telemetry at the end of the day. So that's one part. The other part is the key role of real-time alerts. for example, risky behavior. So some companies are experimenting with systems that trigger alerts. For example, if an AI model output deviate basically from the expected norms. So, for example, bias in prediction, unauthorized access to sensitive data. So this is definitely something that is happening. Um, I mean, there's one topic that is really close to my heart in general, in terms of like responsible AI adoption, which is also very linked to your question, which is what I would call the human in the loop oversight, meaning that continuous monitoring still, I mean, even automatize as much as possible, but I do believe that works best when paired with humans who can interpret the context. And so this is absolutely, absolutely relevant. And then I would close by saying that besides all the challenges, and again, apologies for my lawyer's hat, is that there are some regulatory trends that are encouraging active monitoring. If you think about, for example, the EU AI Act and also the proposed US AI regulations are emphasizing not just on documentation, basically, but also on ongoing oversight, specifically on what they call the AI risk AI systems. And also there are some guidelines specifically that suggested that companies maintain audit trails and monitoring logs, for example, that are auditable in real time, rather just periodically. And just to mention that I think it's the OECD, but I can find the reference that recently, I mean, also international organizations now they are working specifically with companies to produce guidelines. But also according, let's say, to the different market size, to the different company size. So there are definitely some interesting development ongoing.
Thank you, Francesca. We also have a second question from Martin. Some startups think that because they use AWS or similar, cyber risk management is outsourced. What are your thoughts and advice here?
So I would say that, I mean, and thank you so much for the question because it's a sort of like common misconception in startups and even, I would say, some larger companies that just because you use a cloud provider, like the ones that you mentioned, it doesn't mean that, your cybersecurity or risk management is fully outsourced. In reality, the responsibility is shared. And also what I think is very important is to understand where the cloud provider responsibility ends and where yours, in this case, basically begins. It's very critical. There are indeed a shared responsibility model by which you have like cloud providers that make it explicitly, so they secure the infrastructure and not your application or data, for example. So even on AWS, you're fully responsible for your apps, data, users interact with the cloud services. I think that one of the problem is that often startups misjudge, let's say, misassess. I don't know if you can say it in English, but misassess the risk, meaning that they sort of like outsource the mental shortcut, meaning AWS is secure, so I don't need security experts, or they focus, for example, on speed over security. So they prioritize obviously the delivery over proper login, monitoring, and so on. And also, I mean, kind of like a little bit what I was mentioning before, lack of awareness and maturity. And I would say in terms of like practical advice is understand the shared responsibility. So maybe having a clear understanding and the sort of like really practically speaking, a mapping of what, for example, AWS secures versus what your or the startup team must secure. and make it visible for the whole team, meaning that again, this is also a sort of like very important to build the culture inside the organization. Implement a basic cyber hygiene, obviously. I mean, the Bible in a way is to enable, for example, logging and monitoring, the patching and dependency updates that are automated. So, I mean, multi-factor authentication, I mentioned it also before. So basic cyber hygiene is the basic rule. I am always, let's say, and again, maybe I'm saying something that seems pretty, let's say, dumb, but absolutely encrypt sensitive data at rest and in transit, and also manage the keys properly. So don't rely solely, let's say, on the default. And a little bit what I was mentioning before that was also related to the monitoring question before. So the continuous risk monitoring is also super important because again, don't rely only on the infrastructure, on the cloud infrastructure in this case, but also run vulnerability scans on, for example, containers and apps. And well, I mean, I always think that you really need to treat security as a foundational part of DevOps, meaning that you need to have security checks that are embedded. That's very interesting because I remember, I know we are at time, but I mean, just a personal anecdote. I remember at the very, very beginning, let's say, of my career, and when I started approaching the cybersecurity community, and I was working specifically with in collaboration with one of those companies that are verifying the website. It's Verisign. And the funny thing was that when I was discussing with their CISO, he told me the difference between CISOs and the rest of the world is that when the system is running slow, I'm happy because it means, again, it was more than 20 years ago, but it was like, I'm happy because it means that all the security checks that I put in place are running, and so necessarily they're slowing down let's say, the processes and potentially the performance. Whilst, I mean, the rest of the world wants obviously super fast reaction and super fast results. So I think it's this, I mean, the reminder that it's super important to implant the security checks on the overall, even if you're using external clouds services. And then the very last point, and I want to stop, let's say, preaching for this, which is the plan for incident response. Cloud providers don't handle your incident response, you do. And so you or the startup does, let's say. So it's very important to define playbooks for data leaks, compromised credentials, application outages, and also very good communication strategy.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think we ran out of questions when we ran out of time.
So
So
Swiss.
perfect.
Very
So
Swiss.
Swiss.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Francesca, and everybody who
Thanks,
joined
Hannah.
us today. I will send out the follow-up email to all of you who have joined us today. And yes, I'm very much looking forward to hopefully seeing all of you at our upcoming data security and female founders event in Lausanne at Unlimitrust campus with SICPA and Trust Valley. And thank you both. Thank you, Francesca, and also, of course, sisterpreneurs who represented our female community here.